South Carolina put Richard Moore to death by lethal injection for the 1999 deadly shooting of a convenience store clerk.
South Carolina last month reinstated death by firing squad for executions.
A broad appeal for mercy, including by jurors, the judge from his original trial, a former prison director, ordinary people, and members of his family, fell on deaf ears.
What happens when justice walks the line between law and mercy? Richard Moore's name stirred a state and a nation as South Carolina prepared to carry out its first execution in over a decade. But his story wasn't just about a crime. It was about race, repentance, and a justice system under fire. The stakes? A man's life and our conscience. It started on a September night in 1999. Moore, a man battling addiction, walked into Nicky's Speedy Mart in Spartanburg, unarmed. A confrontation erupted between him and clerk James Mahoney. Gunshots were fired. Mahoney died. But the real battle began later. Was this a planned murder or a robbery gone wrong turned tragic? The law called it capital murder. The defense called it self-defense. And the jury sentenced Moore to death.
James Mahoney then grabbed the other gun and fired a shot that hit Richard Moore in the left arm. At that point, Richard Moore fired back, striking the store clerk directly in the heart, killing him.
For over 20 years, Richard Moore sat on death row. He became a spiritual mentor to other inmates, a born-again Christian. In his final years, his legal team fought relentlessly, not just against the sentence, but against the method, arguing that the firing squad or electric chair amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. Meanwhile, over 20 people, including jurors and a former prison director, pleaded for clemency, but time was running out.
Says Moore is a born-again Christian and has been mentoring fellow death row inmates.
In the final hours, press gathered, protesters stood outside the prison gates, and Richard Moore's name echoed across the state. The only person with the power to stop it was Governor Henry McMaster. But no South Carolina governor had granted clemency in decades. Hope was fading. On November 1st, 2024, Richard Moore made his choice: lethal injection. He declined to request a last meal. At 6:24 p.m., he was pronounced dead. In his final statement, he expressed love for his children and regret to the Mahoney family. Outside, reactions were mixed. Some saw justice, others saw a missed opportunity for mercy. The state stood divided, but the sentence was final.
Moore was pronounced dead at approximately 6:24.
My children and granddaughters, I love you and I am so proud of you. Thank you for the joy you have brought to my life.
The execution reignited the debate. Faith leaders, civil rights activists, and even legal professionals condemned the decision. Some pointed to racial bias. Moore, a black man tried by an all-white jury. Others emphasized the cruelty of execution methods. But for many in South Carolina, it raised deeper questions. Are we safer now, or simply more divided?
We are here to say, not in my name. And Governor McMaster has the chance to do something, to reverse racist practices.
Inside the chamber, it was silent. One of Moore's attorneys later reflected, he should never have been a death penalty case. As the lethal drugs entered his body, Moore's transformation from a drug-addicted man to a mentor, a believer, and ultimately a symbol, ended with a final breath. A witness would later say, "It didn't feel like justice, it felt like loss."
I don't believe that Mr. Moore is deserving of the death penalty. The evidence is clear that he entered into the convenience store without a weapon, which shows that his crime doesn't have the kind of premeditation that raises it to be the worst of the worst.
Richard Moore's execution marked more than a resumption of capital punishment in South Carolina. It marked a reckoning. With every act of state-sanctioned death, we are forced to ask, is this justice or vengeance? His story will be remembered not just for how it ended, but for the moral questions it left behind. For all of us, what happens when a teenager's act of cruelty turns into one of the most controversial executions in American history? In 1994, Carrie Grayson was just 19 when he and 3 other teens brutally murdered a hitchhiker, Vicki DeBleu. Decades later, Grayson became the 3rd person in the U.S. to be executed using nitrogen hypoxia, a method that's drawing global scrutiny. This is the case that's igniting new debates about justice, trauma, and the future of the death penalty.
Carrie Grayson was pronounced dead just after 6:30 last night. Grayson, along with 3 others, were charged with the 1994.
Governor Kay Ivey announced that the execution window for Carrie Grayson will open at midnight on November 21st.
Grayson will be put to death for the murder of a woman in Jefferson County in the 90s.
He had started with a ride and ended in horror. Vicki DeBleu was hitchhiking her way home to Louisiana when she met 4 teens near Trussville, Alabama. They offered her a ride. What followed was a nightmare. She was beaten, mutilated, and thrown off a cliff. Grayson was the oldest, 19. The others were 16 and 17. One later bragged about biting an organ. Another gifted a severed finger. All 4 were convicted. But only Grayson, legally an adult at the time, was sentenced to death. This wasn't just a murder, it was a display of depravity that shocked even seasoned prosecutors.
They drove deep into a wooded area and everyone got out. By this point, Vicki realized she was in danger and made a run for it. But the youths caught up to her and began beating her mercilessly.
For 30 years, Grayson sat on Alabama's death row, silent, waiting, forgotten by most. But as his execution neared, lawyers launched last-minute appeals. They challenged the method of nitrogen gas, calling it cruel and experimental. Meanwhile, public support for the death penalty wavered. Even Vicki's daughter, Jody Haley, opposed Grayson's execution. She said, "Revenge shouldn't be justice. I've lived without my mom. I don't want another person to die." But the state moved forward anyway.
Grayson's team says they are filing last-minute appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court, but it's unclear what's been decided.
Midnight on November 21st. The window opens. Grayson's final hours begin as the world watches Alabama's 3rd use of nitrogen hypoxia, a method still unproven, still feared. The clock is ticking. Protesters gather. Appeals are denied. Justice or vengeance is about to be carried out. At 6:06 p.m., the curtain rises. By 6:33, Carrie Grayson is dead. His final act, flipping off the witnesses and cursing staff. His final meal remains unknown, but his message was loud and vulgar. He gasped for air 14 times over 27 minutes. The family of Vicki DeBleu watched silently. Her daughter Jody later said, "No one should have the right to take a life." Alabama officials insisted the method was humane, but what the witnesses saw said otherwise.
Curtain opened about 6:06. He was pronounced deceased at 6:33.
The backlash was immediate. Outside the Capitol, protesters from death penalty action held signs, chanting for reform. They argued this execution and the method used was state-sanctioned torture. Abe Bonowitz called it unnecessary. Even with the public divided, Alabama stands firm. But one thing is clear, the debate over nitrogen hypoxia is just beginning.
This is just another one of those cases, Carrie Grayson, where it's unnecessary. He's not hurt anybody in prison.
Witnesses described it as long, slow, and disturbing. Grayson twitched, gasped, and fought his restraints. Officials called it involuntary. But to those watching, it didn't look painless. This was not the clinical death promised. This was a man struggling for air, live, in front of the state.
The first movements he was doing, all of that, in our opinion and other staff's opinion, that was all show. Just consistent with what he's been doing. Some of his movements, just as we've talked about the other two, you're going to have involuntary body movement in the nitrogen hypoxia executions.
Carrie Grayson's life ended with violence, both given and received. His victim's memory lives on through grief, and now, debate. Was this justice, or another failure in a broken system? As more states consider nitrogen hypoxia, one question lingers. How we execute says a lot about who we are.